Turn to Luke 22 with me, and we're looking at verses 31 to 46, which is our RBT passage for today. And the mood in Luke's gospel as we come to this passage is changing. The opposition to Jesus since he's been welcomed into Jerusalem has been escalated. The religious leaders have sought to publicly trip him up, catch him out, disgrace him in front of the people. And every time Jesus has asked them a better question. And I just love the point at which it says they ask no more questions. They're totally silenced in the face of the wisdom of Jesus. But that doesn't stop them. Earlier on in this chapter, the religious leaders are now plotting to get rid of Jesus, determined to remove him. And Satan is also at work. He enters Judas, and Judas himself, one of the 12, is prepared to betray Jesus. And so the mood is darkening. As we enter this chapter. And yet for Jesus and his disciples, they are gathered at one of the highlights of the year. It's the Passover meal, when hundreds of thousands would be gathered in Jerusalem. All the male Jews were required to come to the capital city. It would have been absolutely rammed full. And you really needed to have some friends in the capital so you could get a decent room for your meal. Jesus has arranged for them to have a special place to gather, an upper room where they can meet. And as we come to this passage now, Jesus and his disciples are reclined at the table. They've enjoyed the meal. They've celebrated the Passover. But even in that familiar surrounds, even in that joyful situation as they recount God's past rescue and celebrate their identity as God's people, Jesus has introduced a note of sorrow. He's taken the bread and talked about his body being given and the cup as his blood. And then he's dropped an absolute bombshell as he said to the disciples that one of you here is going to betray me. And there's shock around the room as they all ask, is it me? What's going on? And then after those announcements, he now in verse 31 turns to Simon. As you can feel the mood and the elation of the meal kind of turning into this gloomy situation. He turns to Simon in verse 31 and says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. So there's a couple of things, even from these opening two verses of our passage. Satan is sifting. Satan wants at the disciples. He wants to give them all a good shaking. That's what a sift does. You shake it around, and the idea is either that the things of substance stay in and the rubbish falls through, or perhaps blows up if you're kind of wafting up and down a little bit. But the idea is there's a shaking. Satan wants to shake God's people. He wants at them. It reminds us, doesn't it, of the story of Job and Satan coming and asking God's permission to harm Job, to remove his possessions and his family, because if he does that, he thinks he'll give up on God. And it's the same picture here. And yet, as we're reminded of the work of our enemy, the enemy of God, who is anti-God's people, we've got this great reassurance, haven't we, in verse 32, as Jesus says to Peter, but he wants to sift you, but I have prayed for you, Simon. And we can't see it in the English, but that you is singular. He focuses in on Simon. Simon, Satan wants to sift everyone here, but I've prayed for you, Simon. There's a particular work for you in this sifting. I've prayed that your faith may not fail, and that when you have turned back, you will strengthen your brothers. Simon, you've got a role through this. Not only have I prayed that your faith will not fail, but that actually your experiences through this trial will be a real blessing to your brothers. You will enable them to be strengthened. Now just look at the words carefully in verse 32. Simon, I have prayed that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Now, you might not notice that on first reading, but when you know the rest of the story, when you've turned back, well, he's going to fall. He's going to deny Jesus. He's going to get himself in a right pickle as he finds himself in the wrong place with the wrong people and really awkward and deciding it's better to say he doesn't know Jesus. He's going to go that far down. And yet Jesus is saying, I pray for you that your faith may not fail. His faith's not going to fail in all of that. Oh, there's a moment where he says the wrong thing, he does the wrong things, but his faith hasn't failed. He's not following Jesus as he. When you turn back, strengthen your brothers. Simon, in the sifting, weakness is going to be exposed. Simon, in the sifting, you're going to let me down. But Simon, in the sifting, I'm praying that your faith will not fail. You're not going to give up. You're not going to walk away from me. And when you've had that humbling experience, when you've failed, when you've denied me, when you've realized that it's not all about how good you are, and yet I still love you, you'll be in a great place to strengthen your brothers, Simon. You'll be in a much better place to care for God's people and to help them. And so, Simon, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. I wonder whether those words echoed in Simon's mind from the moment when Jesus looked at him and he wept to the moment when Jesus specially appeared to him on the third day. I mean, those 2 days must have been miserable for Simon, mustn't they? Utterly miserable, knowing what he'd done. And yet I wonder whether his mind turned back to these words. Your faith will not fail. When you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. Kept him going through that. And eventually, he is the one then, isn't he? Who's able to encourage and strengthen the other disciples. He's the one who takes the lead in the beginning of the book of Acts. He's more prepared for leadership because of his fall, because of Jesus' grace and compassion and patience. He's better equipped to lead. As Christians, we are stronger when we are strong in grace. Strength in grace is recognizing our own weakness, but Jesus is strength. And so that's what we see in verses 31 to 32, a sifting and a strengthening. Satan wants to sift Peter, but I want you to strengthen your brothers after you've experienced this. And then we see in verses 33 to 34 a boasting and a predicting. We've seen sifting and strengthening. Now we see a boasting and a predicting. Peter, I don't just love him. He's almost so predictable. As Jesus says, I prayed for you that your strength will not fail. Don't worry, Jesus. I've got it sorted. I'll come to prison with you. I'll even die with you. I'm there all the way. As we know from the other Gospels, even if all the others run away, I won't. I'll be there to the end. Poor old Peter. Still so confident in his own strength. That's the lesson he's got to learn. Confidence needs to be in Jesus, not himself. And very calmly, Jesus replies in verse 34, I tell you, Peter, before the cock crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. It's interesting, isn't it? Previously, Jesus had to rebuke Peter after Peter had that wonderful revelation that he understood that Jesus was the Messiah. And then immediately as Jesus says, I've got to go to the cross, Peter says, no. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. But on this occasion, he just very calmly replies to Peter and says, look, Peter, whatever you think you're going to do, whatever you think you're capable of, I'm telling you now, before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. Now again, just think about this. Jesus already knows what Peter is going to do. Jesus already knows that his friend is going to deny any knowledge of him. He already knows how quickly he's going to do that. It's going to be before the cock crows today. Between this evening and the early hours of this morning, Peter, you are going to completely deny me. And yet, he still loves him. He's still praying for him. And he says, I've still got work for you to do when you turn back. Isn't that encouraging? Isn't that wonderful? And so we've got boasting and predicting. Peter's boast, Jesus' prediction. And then Jesus, in verses 35 to 38, reminds and warns the disciples. Jesus says, do you remember when I sent you out on the mission before? There were 2. There was the 12 and there were the 72. When I sent you out, I told you not to take a purse, no money, no bag with extra supplies, Not even any spare sandals, just go as you are and go and proclaim my name. And when you come to the towns, find a place where you'll be welcome, stay there, minister, and then move on. And he says, do you remember those missions? Do you remember those times when I sent you out? Did you ever lack anything? And their testimony was, no, nothing. Actually, everything was supplied. Everything we needed. Everywhere we went, we were supplied food, a place to sleep, a welcome. As we went, it was we were welcomed, and we didn't lack anything. It was great. And then Jesus says, verse 36, but now, in complete contrast to those happy days of ministry and excitement, but now, he says, if you have a purse, take it. If you have a bag, take it with you. And ominously, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Jesus is warning his disciples that there is a changing mood. For many months, perhaps for the bulk of the 3 years, they have followed Jesus, and the crowds have gathered and flocked and admired and wondered and been grateful. And as they've gone out as representatives of Jesus, they've been welcomed. But now there's a changing atmosphere. And actually their lives potentially will be in danger, and they will not be provided for. They will not be welcomed. And they're going to have to provide for themselves. Jesus says, but now the atmosphere is changing. Now, the reference to the sword here causes all sorts of problems for the commentators. Why does Jesus say, get a sword? Why? Some of the commentators are so convinced that Jesus would never, ever recommend anyone having a sword, and particularly because a little bit later on in this same chapter, I think it is, I've got my whole Bible in front of me, he tells the disciple Peter to put away his sword, that clearly he can't possibly mean here, you must take a sword with you. And therefore he must be talking metaphorically. Now, I struggle with that, because if the sword is metaphorical, so is the purse and the bag. So what is he actually saying to them? If it's all just metaphor. Other commentators then, some of the more liberal ones, want to say, well, here's the seeds of the fanatical Jesus movement, the Messianic people who wanted to overthrow the Romans. He's telling them to take a sword, and well, that's clearly nonsense as well, isn't it? He does say to Peter, put your sword away. So this is not about rebellion here. He tells his disciples on a regular basis, my kingdom is not of this world. So I think there's a middle ground. It always worries me when I'm looking at commentators and they all come to these conclusions that I don't like any of them, and I come up with one that I've not read. But it seems to me here that Jesus is basically saying, look, there's a changing atmosphere. And you're going to need to provide for yourselves, and you're not going to be welcome. And in a society where there is no police force and those sorts of things, actually, as you're traveling and moving from place to place, you're going to need to take a sword for self-defense. Think of the traveler on the road to Jericho who gets assaulted by the thieves. I think it's just about basic provisions here. And actually, verse 38 tells us the disciples have already got 2 swords. And Jesus says that's enough. Well, it's not enough for rebellion, is it? It's enough potentially if you're wearing it, though, to put a bunch of thieves off from attacking you. So I think that's what's going on here. Jesus is warning them there's a changing atmosphere, and they need to provide for themselves here as they head into troubled times. But more importantly, he tells them then in verse 37 that he is heading into the greatest difficulty. And he quotes here Isaiah 53, chapter that we know so well. Many of us can quote verses from it. It's the chapter that portrays the suffering servant. And here he quotes verse 12, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And look at how clear Jesus is in verse 37. I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. And in case you didn't get that, yes, what is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. Because it was spoken then, it must be fulfilled now. God's prophetic word will come true. But he adds an extra dimension, doesn't he? Say, what was written about me when Isaiah wrote 700 odd years earlier about the suffering servant? He was writing about me, says Jesus. And his words are reaching its fulfillment. This time when Jesus will suffer. when the iniquity of his people will be laid on him. Jesus is very clear what's happening as he heads for the cross. He understands exactly why he has come. And so Jesus then, in these verses 35 to 38, is reminding the disciples, but also warning them of troubled times for them to come, but warning them of the definite end of his time. And so that is how Luke records the end of the Passover meal. That's where the conversation finishes, on that somber note. And then in verse 39, the scene changes because Jesus goes out with the disciples then to the Mount of Olives. And in verses 39 and 40, we see habit and instruction. Notice in verse 39, it says, he went out as usual to the Mount of Olives. The pattern all the way through this week has been that they've met to eat and so on, and then they've headed out onto the Mount of Olives to the garden area of Gethsemane, and there they spent the evening as disciples. And we're told here that Jesus followed the same pattern. Now that's really significant, isn't it? Because Jesus has already announced that one of his disciples is going to betray him. Jesus knows. If Jesus wanted to avoid that, if he wanted to hide from his betrayer, you'd adopt a different pattern. You'd go somewhere else. You wouldn't meet in the same place. But Jesus quite happily goes to the same place as usual, and his disciples follow him. And then he says something really significant to the disciples in verse 40 that gets repeated in verse 46. He says, pray that you will not fall into temptation. Pray that you will not fall into temptation. When Jesus taught his disciples how to pray in the Lord's Prayer, he didn't give them very many words. It's not very long, is it? But in that prayer, temptation. This is a really important element of the disciples' life. A really key part of the disciples' prayer life is to pray that we will not fall into temptation. It's repeated here in verses 40 and 46. It's enshrined into the Lord's Prayer, which we're to learn as a pattern. And Jesus is warning his disciples as the picture builds. Trouble is coming. Those who follow me are going to face difficulty. And so pray. Peter, I'm praying for you because you're going to be sifted. And I'm praying that your faith will not fail. But when you turn back, so Peter, you need to be praying. The focus is clarifying now what Jesus wants us to grasp. As trouble comes, as difficulties will be faced, we need to ask God for protection, that we won't fall into temptation, that we won't stray. Perhaps if Peter had been less busy boasting about how great he was and what he wouldn't do, and had spent more time on his knees, the account in the courtyard in just a few verses would have been very different. And as Jesus then leaves his disciples with that simple instruction, pray that you won't fall into temptation, he then takes himself off. And in verses 41 to 44, we see pleading and submission. He withdraws a stone's throw, takes himself just beyond so he can plead himself, and he gets down on his knees and he prays. This is a garden, it's an evening, it might sound like a nice quiet spot, but what goes on in these verses is warfare. Can you see in verse 44, he is in anguish. This is a war zone now as Jesus is on his knees. As he's praying, he's sweating. His sweat's like drops of blood, records Luke, the doctor. Angelic support is sent to enable him and strengthen him. Verse 43. There's an immense battle going on. And the battle is between doing the Father's will and not having to suffer. Can you pick up a theme? Jesus is warning his disciples, following me will get you into trouble. Following me is difficult. Pray that you won't be led into temptation. And now Jesus is having to fight that battle himself. Listen to his words. Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me. I don't want to suffer. I'd much rather, if there's any other way, don't let me go to the cross. The battle in Jesus' mind and heart and soul is so intense. He's in anguish. He's wrestling. We know from the other gospel accounts that this happens 3 times. But there's eventual submission. As he wrestles it through, as he pleads with his Father, he comes to recognize that there is no other way that the cup can be taken from him. Yet not my will, but yours be done. His will in this sense is that he wouldn't have to go, that he wouldn't have to suffer. That's the wrestle. And what's so significant is that the battle that he wins on his knees here almost seems to carry him through the rest of the battle, the difficulty. Where else do we see him in anguish like this now? There's the physical pain on the cross. There's the anguish of his Father forsaking him, but there's not the sense here of the battle to do the right thing. At this moment, he wins that battle. Through prayer, he overcomes the temptation to walk another way, to go another way. And so when on the cross, the people around him say, if you're the Son of God, get down off the cross. Well, of course he could have done. But he's won the victory here. There's a massive victory won on his knees. So that Jesus is not going to fall to temptation. He is not going to give in to taking the easy option or to listening to the taunts of the people. He's going to win the victory. And then as Jesus rises from these intense battles and goes back to the disciples, in verses 45 and 46, we see sleeping and repeated instruction. One of the commentators suggests there's almost a mini resurrection here. He's gone down to his knees in prayer. Now he's risen from prayer in a kind of victory, foreshadowing what's to come. I don't know whether that's reading too much into it or not, but as he's battled for the salvation of his people, and as he gets back to his disciples, who he's told that you need to pray so that you won't fall into temptation, he finds they're asleep. They're overcome by sorrow. They're exhausted by sorrow before Jesus is even arrested, before the cross even happens. They're completely overwhelmed. And so Jesus says to them again, pray so that you will not fall into temptation. And folks, as we look into this passage this evening, Jesus is warning us that often as his people, we will not be welcomed in this world, that there is hardship for following Jesus, and that there will be temptations to take the easy option, to avoid the suffering, to go with Peter in the denying we know Jesus, to keep it quiet, to hide it, to not follow the Father's will, to speak of Jesus, and to live for Jesus. So we need to pray. We need to pray that we won't be led into temptation, that we wouldn't fall to the devil's whispers in our ears, to the pressures from the outside. But as you hear that call and you see the example of Jesus who was praying so that he didn't fall, isn't it great that Peter's here? Reminding us that this is not about, come on folks, pull up your shoelaces. Come on, pull yourself up. Come on, start praying and you'll get through. No, this is about trusting a Savior who has done it, who has won the victory, who has prayed, who didn't fall into temptation, who is now praying for us, interceding for us, pleading for us. So that though we have the failings, though we do fall, though we do mess up at times, though we do deny Jesus in situations, we will be brought back and we can strengthen one another. We can encourage each other in the grace of God and his patience and mercy. And that should encourage us to pray more that we won't fall into temptation, but with the confidence in God's strength and God's mercy rather than our own. And so Jesus here is this kind of strange blend of example, but also contrast. We need to be more like Jesus than Peter. But thank God that we see Peter, because we can be strengthened in our own faith as we see how Jesus dealt with him in grace and mercy. We need to be encouraged to be more confident, to pray, to follow like Jesus, doing our Father's will, rather than taking the easy way out.